On a Thursday morning in October of 1987, Merle Gustafson drove his pickup truck to the county landfill outside of Hardin County, Iowa, and threw away 11 bent bandsaw blades. They were mill-grade blades, each one about 14 feet long and 2 inches wide, and they had come off the big Timberwolf resaw at the Gustafson family lumber operation on the south edge of Eldora. The blades were warped, kinked, and in 2 cases cracked along the spine. A sharpening service out of Ames had looked at them the previous spring and told Merle the same thing the dealer had told him the year before: not worth fixing, throw them away and order new ones. So Merle did. He tossed them into the scrap metal bin at the landfill, drove home, and ordered 11 new blades from the supplier in Des Moines at $42 apiece. He didn't think twice about it. Nobody in Hardin County would have. Let me tell you about what was sitting at the end of that landfill road, because that detail matters more than anything else in this story. There was a boy there. He was 16 years old, thin in the way that teenage boys are thin before they've grown into their hands, wearing a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large, and a pair of work boots that had belonged to his older brother. His name was Caleb Ostrander, and he had a 1971 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield and a plywood flatbed bolted to the frame where the original bed had rusted out, and he drove that truck to the Hardin County landfill every Saturday morning and sometimes on weekday afternoons after school, not to dump things, to collect them. Caleb Ostrander was 16 years old, and he was already the best knife maker in Hardin County, Iowa, though nobody in Hardin County knew that yet, including Caleb. Let me tell you about Caleb Ostrander because you need to understand the boy before you can understand what he built. His father, Denny Ostrander, ran a small machine shop on the edge of Eldora, the kind of place that fixed tractor PTO shafts and fabricated replacement parts for equipment that hadn't been manufactured since 1963. Denny was not a wealthy man. He was a competent one, which in Hardin County in the 1980s was considered a reasonable substitute. The shop had a drill press, a metal lathe, a small MIG welder, an angle grinder, and a belt grinder that Denny had built himself from a washing machine motor and a length of steel channel iron. The family lived in a house behind the shop, and Caleb had grown up with the smell of cutting oil and hot metal the way other children grew up with the smell of fresh bread or cut grass. By the time he was 12, he could run the lathe unsupervised. By 14, he had built his first knife. That first knife was not good. It was made from a section of old leaf spring, ground to shape on his father's belt grinder, and it had a profile like something a child would draw if you asked them to draw a knife without ever having seen one. The handle was wrapped in electrical tape. The edge held for about 3 cuts before it rolled. Caleb knew it was bad. He also knew exactly why it was bad, which is a different thing entirely from just knowing something failed. He had been reading, not school reading, real reading, the kind you do at midnight with a flashlight because the library book is due back on Monday and you haven't finished it yet. He had found a book at the Eldora Public Library called The Complete Bladesmith by Jim Hrisulas, published just 2 years earlier, and he had read it 4 times. Then he had found every back issue of Blade magazine he could locate at used bookstores in Iowa Falls and Marshalltown, and he had read those too. He understood heat treatment. He understood the difference between high-carbon steel and mild steel, between a convex grind and a hollow grind, between hardness and toughness, and why a blade needed both in the right proportions. He understood these things the way a person understands something they have studied with their whole attention, because nothing else seemed as important. What he did not have was steel. Good steel. High-carbon steel that would take a proper edge and hold it. The leaf spring had been a dead end. Mild steel from the shop was worse. He needed tool steel, and tool steel cost money he didn't have. That's when he started going to the landfill. Let me tell you about what people throw away, because most people don't think about this, and Caleb Ostrander thought about almost nothing else for 2 years. Bandsaw blades are made from high-carbon steel, or in the better grades, from bimetal stock with a high-speed steel tooth edge welded to a flexible carbon steel back. Either way, the material is exceptional for knife making. A blade that is bent or kinked beyond use as a bandsaw blade is not damaged in any way that matters to a knife maker. The steel itself is unchanged. Its grain structure is intact. Its carbon content is exactly what it was when it left the mill. What makes it useless in a sawmill makes it perfect in a forge. You cut out the section you want, away from any crack or kink, and you have a piece of premium high-carbon steel that the mill threw away because it couldn't run straight through a wheel anymore. Caleb had figured this out from the Rasulis book and from 2 articles in Blade magazine that discussed salvage steel sources. He had been going to the landfill for 7 months before Merle Gustafson showed up with those 11 blades. And in those 7 months, he had collected enough material to make perhaps a dozen knives. Merle's 11 blades, each 14 feet long, gave him enough steel to make somewhere between 80 and 100 blades, depending on how he cut them. He loaded them into the F-100 with his brother's help, tying them down with baling twine because they were too long to fit inside the bed, and he drove home at 20 miles an hour with the ends of the blades hanging 4 feet off the back of the truck and a red rag tied to the last one. His father came out of the shop when he heard the truck, looked at the load, and said, "What in the hell?" Caleb explained. His father looked at the blades for a long moment and then looked at his son. "You know what you're doing with those?" Caleb said he did. His father went back inside without another word, which in the Ostrander household was the same as saying yes. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you picture a 16-year-old boy in rural Iowa in 1987 who spends his Saturdays at the landfill collecting other people's trash, what do you see? Because I'll tell you what Hardin County saw. They saw a kid who couldn't afford real materials. They saw a hobby project. They saw the kind of thing that a boy does for a year or two before he grows up and gets a real job. Nobody looked at Caleb Ostrander in 1987 and saw what he actually was, which was a person who had identified a supply chain that everyone else had discarded, in both senses of the word, and who understood the material science of his craft better than most adults who had been doing it professionally for 20 years. Let me tell you about the forge he built, because it matters. Caleb built his first forge from a brake drum off a 1968 International truck, a piece of 2-inch black iron pipe, and a salvaged electric blower from a forced air furnace that had been replaced at the Methodist Church in Eldora. The brake drum sat in a ring of firebrick. The pipe came in from the side as an air-to-air, and the blower pushed air through a gate valve he had made from 2 pieces of flat iron bolted together so you could slide one over the other to control the airflow. It was not elegant. It worked perfectly. He fired it with coal he bought in 50-pound bags from a welding supply in Iowa Falls at $4 a bag, and he could get the fire to welding heat in about 12 minutes. He had built the forge in the fall of 1986 and had been using it for a year by the time Merle Gustafson's blades arrived. The knives he made in the winter of 1987 and 1988 from that first batch of salvage blades were different from anything he had made before. The steel was consistent in a way that leaf spring never was. Leaf spring came from all kinds of sources and could be almost anything in terms of carbon content. But bandsaw blade stock from a production mill was manufactured to a specification, and that consistency showed up in the heat treatment. He could normalize the steel, bring it to critical temperature, quench it in warm canola oil, and temper it in his mother's kitchen oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And the result was a blade with a Rockwell hardness in the low 60s, hard enough to hold an edge through serious work, tough enough not to chip or snap. He made 8 knives that winter. He kept 1. He gave 2 to his father and his brother. He sold 5. He sold them for $35 apiece to men he knew through the shop, a farmer who wanted a good skinning knife, a guy from Iowa Falls who had seen the first knife and asked for one like it, a feed store owner who bought 2 as Christmas presents. $35 was not much. It was also, for a 16-year-old in 1987, not nothing. More importantly, every one of those men came back within 6 months to tell him the knife was the best they'd ever used. The feed store owner called the shop to say that his brother-in-law, who had received one of the knives as a gift, wanted to buy 2 more. Caleb made 2 more. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said and why he said it. Dale Crowley was 44 years old in 1988 and had been running Crowley Hardware and Sporting Goods on the main square in Eldora for 19 years. He was the kind of man who had an opinion about everything and delivered those opinions from behind the counter with the confidence of someone who had been right often enough that he had stopped keeping track of the times he hadn't been. He sold hunting knives. He stocked a wall of them, Case, Buck, Schrade, Gerber, and he knew his customers, and he knew what they bought, and he had been selling knives in Hardin County long enough to have a very clear picture of what the market was and what it was not. He was not a stupid man. He was a certain one, which is a different thing, and in his case the certainty had calcified into something that looked like wisdom but was actually just the weight of habit. Caleb Ostrander walked into Crowley Hardware in March of 1988, carrying 3 knives wrapped in an old dish towel. He was 17 by then. He had grown 2 inches over the winter but was still wearing the oversized canvas jacket, and he had a notebook in his back pocket where he kept records of his heat treatments: steel source, forge temperature by color, quench medium, temper temperature, temper cycles, final hardness estimated by file test. He asked to speak with Dale Crowley, and when Crowley came out from the back, Caleb unwrapped the knives on the counter and explained what they were, where the steel came from, how they were made, and what he was asking for them. He was asking $45 wholesale, which meant Crowley could sell them for $65 or $70 and make a reasonable margin. Dale Crowley picked up the first knife, turned it over in his hands, looked at the grind, looked at the handle, and set it back down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Son, I've got buck knives on that wall that are stamped in a factory by people who know what they're doing. You want me to put a kid's shop project next to a buck knife?" He wasn't cruel about it. He said it the way a man says something he considers obvious, the way you'd explain to someone that the sun rises in the east. He picked up the dish towel, rewrapped the knives, and handed them back across the counter. "Come back when you've got something made on real equipment," he said. "These are nice for what they are." Caleb Ostrander took the knives back. He said, "Thank you for your time," which is what his father had told him to say in situations like this, and he walked out. Now, let me pause here and tell you what Dale Crowley did not know, because it's the thing that makes that moment so much more than just a man dismissing a teenager. He did not know that the steel in those 3 knives was better than the steel in every buck knife on his wall. Not marginally better, substantially better. Buck knives in 1988 were made from 4-2-0HC stainless steel, which is a serviceable material, corrosion-resistant, easy to sharpen, decent edge retention for ordinary use. The bandsaw blade stock Caleb was using was high-carbon tool steel, with a carbon content somewhere between 0.9 and 1.1%, depending on the blade manufacturer, which gave it significantly better edge retention and toughness under hard use. It would rust if you didn't oil it. It would also hold an edge through work that would have a stainless blade folding or chipping. The men who had bought Caleb's knives knew this because they had used them. Dale Crowley knew nothing of the kind because he had not used one and had no intention of doing so. He had looked at the packaging, which was a dish towel, and made his decision. He did not know that the boy standing across his counter had read more about metallurgy and blade geometry than most professional knife makers working in the United States in 1988. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know about the 4 readings of the Chrysalis book or the 2 years of Blade magazine back issues. He did not know that the heat treatment on those 3 knives was more precise and more consistent than anything being done by the production factories whose products he was stocking. What he knew was that the boy was 17 and had a canvas jacket and had made the knives in a shop behind his father's house from steel he had found at the landfill. That was all he needed to know. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 3 years, because the story doesn't end in Crowley Hardware. Caleb kept going to the landfill. He kept collecting blades. The word had gotten around in a small way, not broadly, not in any way that would have registered on Dale Crowley's radar, but among the men who used knives for real work, the word was moving. A butcher in Iowa Falls named Harlan Briggs had bought one of Caleb's knives from the feed store owner who had bought 2 for Christmas presents, and Harlan Briggs used knives every day of his working life in a way that most people do not. He used them on beef carcasses and pork sides and the occasional deer that someone brought in for processing, and he had opinions about knives the way a carpenter has opinions about chisels. He used Caleb's knife for 3 months before he called the Ostrander machine shop and asked if the boy could make him 4 more, 1 for himself and 3 for his employees. He wanted them thinner behind the edge than the first one, more flexible, better for boning. Caleb said he could do that. He made the 4 knives, adjusted the grind geometry based on what Harlan described, and delivered them to Iowa Falls in the F-100 with the plywood bed. Harlan Briggs paid $60 apiece without negotiating. He said, "These are the best boning knives I've ever put my hand on." He was not a man who said things like that casually. He was a man who had been using knives for 30 years and had tried everything from Victorinox to Dexter Russell to custom work from a smith in Minnesota, and he meant exactly what he said. That was 1989. Caleb was 18. He had graduated from high school the previous spring and had declined a partial scholarship to Iowa State, not because he wasn't capable of the work, but because he had looked at what he was building and decided that the thing he needed to learn could not be learned in a classroom in Ames. His mother had not been happy about this. His father had said, "It's his choice," which in the Ostrander household meant the same thing it always meant. Let me tell you about the forge he built in 1989, because it was not the brake drum forge anymore. By 1989, Caleb had enough money saved from knife sales, from part-time work at his father's shop, from a summer spent doing custom fabrication for a farm equipment dealer in Iowa Falls, to build a proper propane forge from a recipe he had worked out from a combination of sources. The Hrusulis book, a technical manual on gas forge design from a ceramic supply company, and a long correspondence he had been conducting for 8 months with a professional bladesmith in New Mexico named Rodrigo Salazar, who had been making knives professionally for 22 years and who had somehow found Caleb through a letter Caleb had written to Blade magazine, asking a technical question about differential heat treatment. Rodrigo Salazar had written back a 4-page letter, then Caleb had written back, then Salazar had written again. By the time they had exchanged 12 letters, Salazar had told Caleb in writing that he was the most technically sophisticated self-taught smith he had ever corresponded with, and that he should consider applying to the American Bladesmith Society's Journeyman program. Caleb built the propane forge in the fall of 1989. It had a ceramic fiber lining, a ribbon burner he had fabricated himself, and a temperature controller he had wired from a thermocouple and a salvaged industrial PID controller his father had pulled from a piece of scrapped equipment. He could hold the forge at any temperature between 1,400 and 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit within plus or minus 15 degrees. This was not something most professional knife makers could do in 1989. Most professional knife makers in 1989 were working by eye, reading the color of the steel, which is a skill that takes years to develop and is still subject to variation based on ambient light and the individual smith's perception. Caleb could work by eye. He could also work by instrument. He used both. The knives he made in 1990 were a different order of thing from the knives he had made in 1987. Not because the design had changed dramatically. The profiles were still clean and practical, still shaped by the requirements of real work rather than by aesthetics, but because the execution had reached a level of consistency that is very difficult to achieve and very easy to recognize when you hold the result in your hand. Every blade came out of the heat treatment within 2 points of Rockwell 62. Every grind was finished to the same geometry within tolerances that a machinist would have recognized as precise. The handles, he had moved from simple wrapped handles to fitted scales of stabilized wood, bone, and micarta. Materials he was sourcing from a supply house in Texas were fitted and finished to a standard that would not have looked out of place on a knife costing $300 from a professional maker. He was selling them for $75. He was 19 years old, working out of a shop behind his father's machine shop in Eldora, Iowa, making knives from steel he still collected at the landfill. Let me tell you about what happened at the Hardin County Farm and Craft Show in the summer of 1990, because that's where things changed. The Farm and Craft Show was held every August at the fairgrounds in Eldora, and it was the kind of event where you could buy a quilt, watch a sheep shearing demonstration, eat a pork tenderloin sandwich, and argue about corn prices all in the same afternoon. Caleb had taken a table there for $20 at the suggestion of Harlan Briggs, who had been telling people about the knives for 2 years and had grown frustrated that Caleb wasn't doing more to sell them. Caleb set up a piece of green felt on the folding table and laid out 14 knives. He had a small card that said Ostrander Blades, Eldora, Iowa, and listed the prices, which ranged from $65 for a simple utility knife to $120 for a full-tang hunter with a stag handle. He had no display case, no banner, no business cards with a logo. He had 14 knives on green felt. Dale Crowley had a table 40 feet away. He sold hardware and sporting goods every year at the Farm and Craft Show, and his table had a proper display rack with his buck and case and Gerber knives arranged by size, and a sign that said, Crowley Hardware, Eldora's sporting goods source since 1969. He saw Caleb's table when he was setting up. He looked at it for a moment, then looked away. By 10:30 in the morning, there were 4 people standing at Caleb's table. By noon, there were 8. By 2 in the afternoon, he had sold 9 of the 14 knives and had taken orders for 6 more, with deposits. The people who stopped were not stopping because of the display. They were stopping because of the knives themselves, which were the kind of objects that make you pick them up even when you weren't planning to. The kind of thing where the weight and the balance communicate something to your hand before your brain has time to form an opinion. And when those people picked up the knives, some of them recognized immediately what they were holding, and those people did not put them back down without buying them. One of those people was a man named Graham Whitaker, who was not from Hardin County. He was from Chicago. He had driven to the Hardin County Farm and Craft Show because his college roommate had a farm outside of Eldora and had invited him for the weekend, and he had come to the show because there was nothing else to do on a Saturday morning in Eldora in August. Graham Whitaker worked for a specialty kitchen supply company in Chicago that sold high-end cooking equipment to restaurants and serious home cooks, and he had been looking for an American-made handmade knife to add to the company's catalog. He picked up a chef's profile knife Caleb had made. It was not a traditional chef's knife. It was a working knife with a chef's profile, which is a different thing. And he turned it over and looked at the grind and looked at the handle and asked Caleb what the steel was and what the hardness was. Caleb told him. Whitaker asked how many he could make in a month. Caleb thought about it and said 8 if he was making only that profile. Whitaker asked if he would consider a wholesale arrangement. Caleb said he would consider it. They talked for 45 minutes at the green felt table while the Farm and Craft Show moved around them. Whitaker bought 2 knives that day and left Caleb his business card. He said he would call the following week. He did call the following week. The conversation lasted an hour and a half, and at the end of it, Caleb Ostrander had a wholesale agreement to supply 8 chef's knives per month to a Chicago kitchen supply company at a wholesale price of $90 per knife, which meant a retail price of somewhere between $160 and $180 per knife, which was, in 1990, a serious price for a handmade American kitchen knife from an unknown maker. He was 19 years old. He was still collecting blades at the landfill. Let me tell you about what Dale Crowley heard, because he heard about the Chicago deal within 2 weeks, and what he heard made him do something that revealed exactly who he was. The feed store owner told him. Not maliciously, just the way news moves in a small town, the way one piece of information attaches itself to another and arrives at its destination without anyone particularly intending to deliver it. Dale Crowley heard that the Ostrander boy had made some kind of deal with a company in Chicago to sell his knives in the city, and that the knives were going to retail for $160. Crowley's reaction, delivered to the feed store owner and later repeated at the co-op and at the diner on the square, was this: Chicago's full of people who'll pay $160 for anything if you tell them it's handmade. That doesn't mean it's worth $160. It means they've never used a real knife. He said it with the smile of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and knows exactly how it ends. He said it with confidence. He said it loud enough that it got back to Caleb within a week, as these things always do in a town of 6,000 people. Caleb heard it. He wrote it down in the notebook, at the bottom of a page of heat treatment records, in his careful small handwriting. He did not say anything about it to anyone. Now, let me tell you about the next 4 years, because they are the reason this story is still being told. The Chicago arrangement worked. It worked better than either Caleb or Graham Whitaker had expected, and it worked for a reason that neither of them had fully anticipated, which was that the restaurants that bought the knives from Whitaker's company started talking about them. Not in the way that restaurants talk about equipment, not in press releases or in menu descriptions, but in the way that professional cooks talk about tools, which is quietly, specifically, and with the authority of people who use those tools every day for 8 hours and know exactly what they can do. A sous chef at a French restaurant on the north side of Chicago used one of the Ostrander chef's knives for 3 months and then bought 2 more, one for herself and one for the line cook she was training. A food writer who ate at that restaurant asked the chef what knife she was using, because the way she moved with it was different from the way most cooks moved with their knives, and the chef said it was a custom blade from a smith in Iowa. The food writer wrote a paragraph about it in a piece about American artisan food producers that ran in a Chicago magazine in the spring of 1991. That paragraph generated 47 letters to the magazine asking where the knives could be purchased. Whitaker forwarded them to Caleb. Caleb was 20 years old and making 8 knives a month and had a waiting list for the first time in his life. He raised his prices, not dramatically. He went from $90 wholesale to $110. But the raise was necessary because the demand had exceeded what he could produce at the old price, and he needed to be able to invest in equipment. He bought a surface grinder. He bought a proper 2-wheel grinder with a variable speed controller. He bought a hydraulic press for forge work. He bought all of it used, sourced from industrial liquidation sales that his father helped him find, and he paid for all of it in cash because he did not believe in borrowing money for equipment he wasn't sure he could use. This was his father's philosophy, and he had absorbed it without being taught it, the way children absorb the deepest things. He also kept going to the landfill, not because he had to. By 1991, he could afford to buy steel from a proper tool steel supplier in Cleveland, and he did buy some of it, particularly for specific alloys he needed for particular applications. But the bandsaw blades were still there, still being thrown away by mills and shops that didn't know what they had, and the steel was still good. And there was something in the act of collecting it that Caleb was not ready to give up. It was the foundation of the thing. It was where it had started. He kept a stack of salvaged blades in the corner of the shop, next to the new steel, and he used both. Let me tell you about 1992, because 1992 was the year the thing became undeniable. A knife maker named Silas Bontrager, who worked out of Goshen, Indiana, and had been making knives professionally for 15 years, came to Eldora in the spring of 1992. He had heard about Caleb through the American Bladesmith Society, where Caleb had applied for journeyman status the previous year at Rodrigo Salazar's urging and had passed the qualification tests on his first attempt, which was not common. Bontrager drove to Eldora to see the shop and to meet the person whose work he had been hearing about for 2 years. He spent an afternoon in the shop, watched Caleb work, handled a dozen finished knives, and asked to see the steel stock. When Caleb showed him the salvaged bandsaw blades alongside the commercial tool steel, Bontrager was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're still using the landfill steel?" Caleb said he was. Bontrager picked up one of the salvaged blades, looked at it, set it back down. He said, "I've been buying steel for 15 years. That's better than half of what I've paid for." Caleb said he knew. Bontrager went home and wrote a piece for the American Bladesmith Society newsletter about salvaged steel sources, citing Caleb's work as the primary example. The piece circulated among the Society's membership and generated more correspondence than any newsletter piece that year. 3 members wrote to ask if Caleb would be willing to share his heat treatment data for the bandsaw blade stock. He shared it. He sent them the relevant pages from the notebook, photocopied. That fall, Caleb was invited to demonstrate at the Knife Makers Guild show in Kansas City. He was 21 years old. He drove to Kansas City in the F-100, which now had a proper bed but still had the cracked windshield, and he set up a table at the show with 30 knives and a small framed photograph of the brake drum forge he had built in 1986. He sold 26 of the 30 knives in 2 days. The 4 he didn't sell he took back to Eldora and sold within a week to people on the waiting list. He came home from Kansas City and called his father from the shop phone. He said, "I think this is going to work." His father said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 1993, because that's when Dale Crowley came to see him. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, 6 years almost to the month from the day Merle Gustafson had thrown those 11 blades into the scrap bin at the landfill. Caleb was in the shop when he heard a vehicle pull up, and he came out to find Dale Crowley standing next to a late-model Buick, wearing a barn coat and looking at the shop with the expression of a man who is trying to appear casual about something that is not casual to him. Crowley was 50 now, and the certainty that had always been his defining characteristic had developed some cracks in it over the preceding years, the way certainty does when the world keeps producing evidence against it. He said, "I heard you're doing well." Caleb said he was doing all right. There was a pause. Crowley looked at the shop again. He said, "I've got customers asking me for your knives. I've had 4 people in the last 2 months come in and ask specifically if I carry Ostrander blades." He said the name carefully, the way you say something you've been practicing. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in working out an arrangement." Caleb looked at him for a moment. He was 22 years old, and he had the kind of stillness that some people develop when they have spent years doing precise work alone in a quiet shop, and he used that stillness now. He said, "You told the feed store owner that Chicago was full of people who'd pay $160 for anything if you called it handmade." Crowley's face did something complicated. Caleb said it without anger, without emphasis, the same way he might read a heat treatment record back from the notebook. Just the information, delivered accurately. Crowley said, "I may have said something like that." Caleb said, "You did?" Another pause. Crowley said, "I was wrong about that." Caleb thought about it. He said, "My wholesale price is $120 now. Minimum order is 6 knives. I have a 4-month lead time." Crowley said that was fine. Caleb said, "I'll put you on the list." Crowley nodded. He started to say something else, then seemed to decide against it. He got back in the Buick and drove away. Caleb went back into the shop. He picked up the notebook, found the page where he had written Crowley's comment in small handwriting at the bottom of the heat treatment records, and he drew a single line through it. Not to erase it, just to mark it. Let me tell you about what the shop looked like by 1995, because the transformation is the point. By 1995, Ostrander Blades was supplying knives to 11 kitchen supply retailers in 7 cities, had a waiting list of 4 to 6 months for custom orders, and had been written about in 3 national publications, including a piece in Sawyer magazine that described the knives as the best working kitchen knives made in America. Caleb was 24. He had hired 1 employee, a young man from Iowa Falls named Tobias Lindgren, who had come to the shop asking for an apprenticeship and who had demonstrated in a 2-hour trial session that he had the patience and the precision the work required. He was paying Tobias $12 an hour, which in 1995 in Hardin County was a serious wage for a 20-year-old. The shop had grown. Not dramatically. Caleb had added a lean-to on the south side of the original building to house the surface grinder and the hydraulic press, but it was still recognizably the shop behind his father's machine shop, still in Eldora, still on the south edge of town. The F-100 was still in the driveway. The cracked windshield had finally been replaced, and in the corner of the shop, next to the rack of commercial tool steel from the supplier in Cleveland, there was still a stack of salvaged bandsaw blades. Not as many as there had been in the early years. Caleb was now buying more of his steel than he was collecting. But they were there. A few mills and shops in the area had started saving their bent blades for him rather than throwing them away, leaving them at the end of the driveway with a note, the way you might leave something for a neighbor you know will use it. Word had gotten around, in that slow, specific way that word gets around in rural Iowa, that the Ostrander boy wanted the blades that nobody else wanted. Merle Gustafson had found out about this in 1992, when someone at the co-op had mentioned it in passing. He had driven out to the shop one afternoon and stood in the driveway for a while, looking at the building before he knocked. Caleb had come out and they had talked for 20 minutes. Merle had asked about the blades, and Caleb had explained what the steel was and what he did with it, and Merle had stood there listening with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. He said, "I threw 11 blades away in '87, right at the landfill." Caleb said, "I know, I was there." Merle was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've been saving them since '92. I've got a pile of them out at the mill." Caleb said he'd be glad to take them. Merle said, "I'll bring them by." He brought them by the following Saturday. There were 37 blades. He wouldn't take anything for them. Let me tell you about the night in 1994 when Caleb's father came into the shop after dinner, because it's a small moment and it's the one that matters most. It was a November evening, cold enough that the shop needed the propane heater running, and Caleb was finishing a set of 6 chef's knives for a restaurant in Minneapolis. His father came in without knocking. He never knocked, it was his property, and stood watching for a while without saying anything. Caleb kept working. After a few minutes, his father picked up one of the finished knives from the rack where they were waiting to be handled, turned it over, looked at the grind, set it back. He said, "Rodrigo Salazar called today." Caleb looked up. Salazar had been in correspondence with Caleb for 5 years now, and they had met twice, once at the Kansas City show and once when Caleb had driven to New Mexico for a week to work in Salazar's shop. His father said, "He wants to know if you'd be willing to teach at a symposium in Santa Fe next spring, a week-long thing for the society." Caleb said, "What did you tell him?" His father said, "I told him I'd pass it along." He set the knife back on the rack. He said, "You should go." Caleb said he was thinking about it. His father said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you it's the right thing." He went back to the house. Caleb went to the symposium in Santa Fe in April of 1995. He was 24 years old, and he taught a 4-day session on salvage steel selection and heat treatment to a room of 23 knife makers, most of whom were older than he was, several of whom had been making knives professionally for longer than he had been alive. He brought the notebook, he put it on the table at the front of the room, and told them that everything they were going to cover for the next 4 days was in it, and that the notebook had started in 1986 when he was 15 years old and had been trying to figure out why his first knife was bad. One of the men in the room, a smith from Oregon who had been making knives for 30 years, picked up the notebook during the lunch break and read it for 45 minutes. When the afternoon session started, he said, "I've been doing this for 30 years and I learned 3 things from this notebook that I didn't know." Caleb said, "The notebook learned them from the blades. Now let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end in Santa Fe and it doesn't end in 1995. In the fall of 2003, a woman named Iris Lindgren, Tobias Lindgren's younger sister, came to work at Ostrander Blades as the shop's first full-time production manager. She had a degree in business from the University of Northern Iowa and had spent 4 years working for a manufacturing company in Waterloo before she decided she would rather work somewhere that made something worth making. She reorganized the order system, built a proper waiting list database, negotiated better terms with the steel supplier in Cleveland, and within 18 months had reduced the average lead time from 5 months to 3 without increasing production. She also started keeping records of the salvaged steel stock in a way that allowed Caleb to track which blades came from which mills, which alloys performed best in which applications, and what the actual cost comparison was between salvaged steel and commercial stock. The answer, on a per-knife basis, was that the salvaged steel cost approximately $4 per blade in collection and processing time, against an average of $22 for equivalent commercial stock. Over the course of a year, the salvaged steel represented a material cost saving of somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on the production mix. Iris put that number in a report and left it on Caleb's workbench. He read it, set it down, and went back to work. He had known the number was approximately right. Knowing it precisely didn't change anything. He was going to keep using the salvaged steel regardless. Let me tell you about where Ostrander Blades is today, because the ending is not a dramatic one, and that's exactly the point. The shop is still in Eldora, Iowa. It's larger now, a proper building, purpose-built, with a dedicated forge room, a grinding room, a finishing room, and a small showroom where you can look at the current production work through a glass wall while someone explains the waiting list to you. The waiting list is currently 14 months for a custom order and 6 months for a production knife. There are 4 full-time employees. Tobias Lindgren is still one of them, a senior smith now with 17 years in the shop, and he teaches the apprenticeship program that Caleb started in 2001. The F-100 is in the showroom, parked in the corner, with the plywood bed and the cracked windshield that was replaced and then, at some point, cracked again. Nobody has replaced it this time. In the corner of the forge room, next to the rack of commercial tool steel, there is still a stack of salvaged bandsaw blades. There are always salvaged bandsaw blades in that corner. Mills and shops from 4 counties now save their bent blades and call the shop, and someone drives out to collect them in a newer truck that has a proper bed and an uncracked windshield. The blades go into the corner, and from the corner they go to the forge. And from the forge, they go into the hands of chefs and hunters and butchers and serious cooks who paid a serious price for them and will use them every day for 20 years and then hand them to someone else. Caleb Ostrander is 53 years old. He still works in the shop every day, though not as many hours as he used to, and he still does the heat treatment himself on every blade that comes through the forge room, because that is the part of the work he will not delegate. He still uses the notebook, a different notebook now, the 14th in the series, but the same format, the same handwriting, the same categories: steel source, forge temperature, quench medium, temper temperature, temper cycles, final hardness. The first 13 notebooks are in a fireproof cabinet in the office. Iris Lindgren's idea. Caleb thought it was unnecessary. He keeps them anyway. Dale Crowley retired in 2001 and sold Crowley hardware to a man from Des Moines who turned it into a farm supply store. Before he retired, he had been stocking Ostrander knives for 8 years and had sold more of them by dollar volume than any other item in the store. He never said anything more about Chicago or about people who paid $160 for anything they called handmade. He didn't need to. The knives said it for him every time someone picked one up and decided not to put it back down. Merle Gustafson died in 2009. His son, a man named Ellis Gustafson, runs the mill now, and Ellis Gustafson still saves the bent blades and still calls the shop when he has a pile worth collecting. He has never thrown a bent blade away in his life. He couldn't tell you exactly when he started thinking of them as something valuable rather than something disposable. It happened gradually, the way understanding always happens, not in a moment but over time, as the evidence accumulated and the old assumption quietly became impossible to maintain. There is a detail from the 1990 Farm and Craft Show that Caleb mentioned once, in an interview with a food publication in 2008, that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said that when he was setting up the green felt table that morning, Dale Crowley had looked over at him from 40 feet away, and their eyes had met for a moment, and then Crowley had looked away. Caleb said he had understood in that moment that Crowley was not going to come to his table. Not because Crowley was a bad man, he wasn't, but because Crowley had already decided what the table was and what the boy behind it was, and no amount of evidence was going to change a decision that had been made before the evidence was examined. Caleb said he had spent about 10 seconds thinking about this, and then he had straightened the knives on the felt and waited for the first customer. That is what patience looks like when it belongs to someone who knows they're right. He drove to the landfill in a truck with a plywood bed. He loaded the bent blades nobody wanted. He drove home at 20 miles an hour with a red rag on the end. He built a forge from a brake drum and a church furnace blower. He read the books. He kept the notebook. He made the knives. They laughed at the landfill steel. They laughed at the dish towel. They laughed at the canvas jacket and the plywood truck bed and the boy who thought he could compete with Buck and Case and Gerber from a shop behind his father's machine shop in Eldora, Iowa. The landfill steel is still in the corner of the forge room. The notebook is in the fireproof cabinet. The knives are in 14 cities, in the hands of people who use them every day and will never throw them away. That's what happens when a boy sees treasure where everyone else sees trash.